Welcome to the walkthrough of frequently made mistakes for assignment 4 in my CS 5254 course in the summer of 2023. There were a number of issues with the stamped lock Palantir Manager implementation, most of them centering on the acquire method. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the problems that I identified and what you might do to correct them. First, make sure that you create an entry set and not a Palantir to store the results of doing the lookup. You'll see why in a minute. That's important. Next, please don't use getKey here. You want to make sure that this returns an entry set and not a Palantir, so don't use getKey. Also, please don't use put or replace, since that's inefficient and defeats the purpose of using an entry set. Instead, you want to use an entry set so you can set the value to false much more efficiently without having to do the full lookup, which would be required with put or with replace. Let's come down here and look at another problem with a different implementation of acquire. Here, this code has a serious race condition since you're trying to access the entry set without holding a read lock. Remember, this is the stamped lock implementation, so you start out by acquiring a read lock and then you'll try to upgrade it to a write lock. But you first have to have it as a read lock. If you don't acquire a read lock here, then you're going to have race conditions and you'll probably get very, very weird results when you run the program. Secondly, down here, now much too late, you're trying to acquire a read lock, but it's too late because you've already gone ahead and done the filter and gotten the value, and this has already been subject to a race condition. And in fact, this entry may have already been taken by a different thread that's calling into the fair semaphore stamped lock implementation of the Palantir Manager by the time you get here. So that's erroneous. And then this loop shouldn't be happening here. The loop needs to be happening way up here. It needs to be looping around the entire lookup using the entry set and the stream and the filter and so on. This is going to be much too long and it'll end up doing spinning and other bad things. Let's come down here and take a look at another example of acquire that needs to be fixed. So this code needs to go inside a loop, just like all the other examples we've looked at of stamped lock. Please go back and look at the many examples that I showed, both in the asynchronous videos and also in live session videos we went through where we took a look at how to use stamped lock. It always goes in a loop. This code needs to be called in a loop. This code needs to be called in a loop, and you don't want to be calling this twice. You just want to call it once. That's kind of the purpose of using a loop, to factor out this redundant code. Once again, please don't use put here, since that's inefficient and it defeats the whole purpose of using an entry set. Instead, use the entry set to set the value to false. But of course, you have to make sure you have the write lock held before you do that. Also, please don't implement the undergrad version. I'm not quite sure why this is occurring here, but it shouldn't be. Yet another issue with acquire. So this particular approach isn't leveraging the read lock at all, since immediately down below, it's converted to a conditional write lock, or as an attempt to convert it to a conditional write lock. So you want to first acquire the read lock, and then with the read lock held, you want to read the data. And then if you get what you want, then you try to conditionally convert it to a write lock and then do the other things you need to do. So also down here, you want to use get value, not set value. The stream should be called with the read lock held, not with the write lock held. Notice that this is going to grab the write lock too soon. We want to first do things with the read lock held because there's less contention that way, or at least ideally there's less contention. And then down here, I'm not sure why there are these redundant calls or the extra calls here to first unlock the read lock, which is correct, then acquire the stamped lock for writing. That's correct. And then you immediately unlock the write lock and then reacquire the read lock. That makes no sense at all. So make sure that you don't do that. Instead, please go back and take a careful look at the implementation of the code that we use for stamped lock in the examples, and you'll see the right way to do this kind of stuff. So now we're going to take a look at the final problem in this code. This is the release method from the stamped lock fair semaphore Palantir Manager. And what the problem is here is that you only want to release the semaphore if the exception is not thrown. If the exception is thrown, then you do not want to release the semaphore, because that means that there was an invalid Palantir that was passed in to the release method. So you need to conditionally call release only if you don't throw the exception. This is a very subtle bug, and I don't think the test cases catch it. We're going to update the test cases to catch it in the future. So please make sure you fix that, because otherwise you'll have problems if an exception is thrown. So that's the end of the walkthrough of the frequently made mistakes. Most people had issues with acquire, so make sure you go back and take a careful look at this. Chances are, if your acquire method is implemented incorrectly, you will probably get a failure of the integration tests, but that doesn't really give you a good sense of where the problems arise. We're working on improving the regression tests to find those problems and make it easier to fix, but in reviewing the code, I think I've caught most of the problems. So please make sure you take a look and get those working before you submit your final version for grading.